James Morgan sat back in the luxurious leather seat of the first-class lounge, his fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold. The polished marble floors around him gleamed under the soft lighting, casting a glow on the quiet, almost sterile environment of the airport's exclusive lounge. His eyes traced the line of passengers in business attire, some reviewing last-minute work emails, others lost in their phones. It was a world he had worked hard to enter, one filled with polished shoes and the quiet hum of success. This flight, however, was different. It wasn't just about the business deals, the awards, or the bustling meetings that had defined his life for years. This flight marked a moment of personal triumph. For the first time, James was stepping onto a plane, in first class, and not just for him. It was for Sophia, his 8-year-old daughter, and the dream he had promised his late wife, Emma. The promise he had made to her during her last days echoed in his mind like a quiet vow. He would show Sophia the world, give her the experiences they had once talked about, the ones they had imagined sharing together before illness had taken Emma's life too soon. That promise had kept James grounded through the darkest times, and now, as he sat in the quiet luxury of the lounge, it was about to come true. Their first trip together as father and daughter would be to London, the destination that Emma had always dreamed of. For James, it wasn't just a vacation, it was a legacy. It was his way of honoring the life Emma had lost and making sure Sophia would carry a piece of her mother's spirit with her forever. He could already picture it. Sophia's wide eyes as they toured the Tower of London, her face lighting up when they saw the castles, as the announcement rang over the loudspeaker. Calling for the first-class passengers to board, James felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. It had been a long journey, one of late nights, early mornings, and countless challenges, as he built his architectural firm from the ground up. But here he was. The hard work had paid off. This seat, this moment, was his reward, and more importantly, it was a chance to give Sophia something far greater than just luxury, an unforgettable experience with her father. Sophia, with her little backpack slung over her shoulder, stood by his side, her eyes dancing with excitement. She was dressed in a tiny navy blue blazer, a miniature version of his own, and her small fingers pressed eagerly against the glass of the lounge's panoramic windows as she gazed out at the tarmac below. "Dad, is that our plane?" she asked, her voice filled with the same wonder that had been in her mother's when she had first seen the world. James smiled, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest. "That's the one, champ," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Our ride to see the castles." Sophia's excitement was infectious. For a moment, James allowed himself to lean back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly. In the midst of the chaos of everyday life, the board meetings, the phone calls, the projects that seemed to never end, this quiet moment with his daughter was his peace. He couldn't help but feel proud of what he had built for her, of the life they were about to share together, and the memories that were about to be made. James had always been the one to stay focused, to chase success relentlessly, but now, with Sophia by his side, he realized the true weight of success wasn't measured by accolades or titles. It was measured in moments like this, watching his daughter grow, knowing she would carry a piece of her mother's love with her on every adventure, every challenge, every experience that awaited them. And so, as they walked toward the gate, hand in hand, James couldn't help but smile. The promise he had made was about to be fulfilled, and in that moment, he knew that no matter what happened on the flight, this was a journey they would remember forever. As the announcement for boarding rang out, James felt a rush of excitement mixed with nerves. He looked down at Sophia, whose small hand gripped his tightly. Her eyes were wide with wonder, her excitement as contagious as ever. This was a moment of joy, of success, of fulfillment. The world had opened its doors to them, and they were walking through it together. Yet, something lingered at the back of James's mind, a subtle tension he couldn't shake. They walked past the sleek, modern gate agent, who offered a courteous smile and greeted them professionally. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Morgan," the agent said, barely glancing up from his screen. For a brief moment, everything felt right. But as they moved through the jet bridge and entered the plane, James noticed the shift. The first-class cabin of Aeroline International was a sanctuary of luxury. Soft, muted tones of cream and gold bathed the entire space. Plush seats, equipped with personal pods and touchscreens, surrounded them. The air was filled with a sense of tranquility, a stark contrast to the chaos of the bustling airport they had just left behind. James guided Sophia to their seats, settling into the spacious, expansive pod. His heart swelled with pride as he watched her explore the intricate features of the seat. The recline, the privacy screen, the buttons that made the chair shift to a completely flat position. It was all for her. "Look, Dad, look at this. I can watch a movie on this big screen." Sophia's voice was a little too loud for the quiet cabin, but James didn't mind. Her happiness was infectious. He chuckled softly, proud of how well she had taken to flying first class. It was everything he'd hoped for, an experience she would remember forever. But as the flight attendants began to settle passengers into their seats, James noticed something that made his stomach turn. A brief but unmistakable glance. The flight attendant with blonde hair and a sharp, severe bun, Caroline, was scanning their boarding passes. Her smile was polite, but James felt something off in the way she looked at him. Her eyes flicked from his ticket to his face, then quickly to Sophia's. James had spent years studying the subtle cues in people's expressions. He was an architect, after all. He was trained to read spaces and the people within them. That brief flicker of hesitation, the subtle raising of her brow, the way her eyes moved, James recognized it immediately. It was the momentary cognitive dissonance in the eyes of someone who couldn't quite reconcile what they were seeing. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Morgan," Caroline said, her voice smooth, professional. Yet, her eyes remained fixed on the boarding passes, examining them with more scrutiny than necessary. James, never one to make a scene, simply nodded. "Good afternoon," he replied, his voice steady, offering her a small smile. He knew how to navigate these social situations, how to avoid confrontation. But something about her gaze made him uncomfortable. It wasn't just the professional routine he was used to. It was something more. Something personal. "Could I have a quick look at your boarding pass again, please?" Caroline asked, her tone polite, but with an edge of something colder beneath it. James felt his heart rate quicken slightly. He had already shown his ID and boarding pass at the gate, at security, and now, after having just been seated, she was asking for it again. This wasn't routine, it was excessive. The situation was starting to feel all too familiar, the kind of situation he had encountered before, but had learned to ignore. This wasn't just about checking a ticket, it was about being seen, or rather, being doubted. "Of course," James replied, keeping his voice neutral. He handed her the boarding pass without hesitation, maintaining a calm demeanor. Caroline took the document, her fingers lightly grazing his hand as she examined it closely. She paused a beat too long, her gaze flickering between his face and the boarding pass. Something in the air shifted. The warm, comforting atmosphere of first class suddenly felt colder, heavier. James didn't know if it was the way she held his boarding pass for just a moment too long, or the subtle discomfort in the air, but he felt it, a sense of being out of place. Even here, in the very seat he had earned, Caroline handed the boarding pass back with a small, tight-lipped smile. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan. You're all set," she said, though her tone was slightly more strained than it had been before. James nodded, though the knot in his stomach hadn't loosened. He had barely taken a deep breath when Caroline appeared again, this time with a tablet in her hand, her expression more serious than before. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice polite but carrying an edge of something more insistent, "I'm sorry. to disturb you, but my system is flagging an issue with your ticket. I'll need to see your identification once more." James blinked in disbelief. The systems must have been fine, he thought. He'd already shown his ID twice, once when he checked in, once at the gate before boarding. Was this some sort of mistake? No. The sharpness in Caroline's voice, the firmness of her posture. This wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate move, and he wasn't sure why. The knot in James's stomach tightened again, this time deeper than before. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, watching the exchange unfold. Caroline's tone was more overtly demanding now, her gaze flicking nervously between James and the passengers in first class, who had begun to glance over curiously. The quiet murmur of the cabin, once filled with the soft conversations of elite business travelers, began to fade as the tension grew. "Ma'am, you just checked my ID less than half an hour ago," James said, his voice steady but low, trying to keep the exchange private. "What seems to be the problem?" Caroline hesitated, looking down at her tablet for a moment, before meeting his eyes again. "It's a system issue, Mr. Morgan. We just need to verify the information once more." James felt the weight of her words. He knew the systems inside out. He had seen them in use hundreds of times during his travels for work, and they had never been wrong. He was certain there was no mistake on his end, but it wasn't just the technicalities of the situation that gnawed at him. It was the underlying tone, the persistent questioning, the scrutiny that felt less about protocol and more about something far more personal. He could feel the faint whispers of bias in the air, subtle but undeniable. Why was he being singled out? He looked over at Sophie again. She was oblivious to the growing tension, lost in the movie, but James knew she could sense the shift in his mood. Her excitement had faded, replaced by a slight furrow of confusion in her brow as she glanced up at him. "Are you okay, Dad?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the thick silence of the moment. James forced a smile, trying to push the knot in his chest down. "Yeah, sweetheart, I'm just fine." But deep inside, something was shifting. The easy confidence he had walked onto the plane with, the calm pride of a father who had worked hard to create a life for his daughter, was slowly being chipped away. What should have been an exhilarating experience, a luxurious moment he had earned, was becoming a battle. And the worst part was that it wasn't just about the physical act of showing his ID again. It was the emotional weight that came with it, the subtle implication that he didn't belong, that he wasn't worthy of being in this space. Caroline stepped away briefly, walking toward the rear of the cabin, and James leaned back in his seat, trying to steady his breath. The moment felt like it was passing, like everything might return to normal. But it was a fleeting thought. He knew that this wasn't going to end quietly. A few minutes later, Caroline returned, this time with a slightly more forceful air. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice louder now, drawing the attention of the passengers around them. "I'm afraid I need to check your ID again." James looked at her, his expression no longer polite, but now more confused and frustrated. "We've already done this," he said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of irritation. "You checked it at the gate, and you checked it when we boarded." Caroline's expression didn't change. "I'm sorry, sir," she repeated, her tone now tinged with an insincerity that James could feel in his bones. "It's just procedure." James clenched his fists at his sides, the tension in his shoulders palpable. He knew that something was deeply wrong with the way he was being treated. He had done everything by the book. He had shown his ID, his boarding pass, and everything had checked out. But this felt like harassment. This wasn't just about verifying information. It was about something deeper, something James couldn't ignore anymore. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, watching the scene unfold. Some of them were starting to whisper, murmurs of curiosity and concern rising. James didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to escalate things any further. But the more Caroline persisted, the more he realized he couldn't back down. not for himself, and certainly not for Sophie. "You've checked my ID 3 times now," James said, his voice cool but unwavering. "This is harassment, and if you don't stop, I'm going to escalate this." Caroline's smile faltered, and for the briefest moment, James could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but it didn't last long. Her professional veneer snapped back into place, and she stepped back, holding her tablet as if it were an impersonal object of authority. The moment hung in the air, suspended. The entire first-class cabin was silent now, watching with rapt attention. James's heart was racing, but he stood firm, looking at the flight attendant, daring her to continue, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire world held its breath. The cabin felt oddly still as the flight continued its climb into the sky. The usual hum of engines, the soft chatter of first-class passengers, the gentle clink of glasses, it all seemed distant, like a background noise James had stopped noticing. All of it was now overshadowed by the uneasy tension that gripped him, a pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with the altitude. James tried to return to his seat, to relax, but each passing minute felt heavier than the last. Sophie, still immersed in her movie, seemed blissfully unaware of the growing tension. He admired that about her, her ability to remain untouched by the stress and chaos around her. But James couldn't help feeling like something deeper was at play. The flight was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a celebration. Instead, he felt like he was being subtly scrutinized, tested. It wasn't just the repeated requests for his identification that bothered him. It was the manner in which they were asked. Each time Caroline came back, her attitude shifted, and so did the energy in the cabin. The polite professionalism had given way to something colder, more calculating. The passengers around him, too, had started to take notice. The whispers had begun. James could feel their eyes on him, the invisible weight of their curiosity, their judgment. He was just about to settle in, hoping that this was all just a bad moment passing, when Caroline approached once more. She walked toward him, her posture stiff and formal. But something was different this time. There was a hint of finality in her movements, a sense of determination that made his stomach churn. This wasn't just about ID checks anymore. It was about something more personal. The subtle challenge he had felt earlier had now morphed into an all-out confrontation. "Mr. Morgan," she said, her voice louder this time, almost deliberately so. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but my system is flagging an issue with your ticket. I need to see your identification once more." James's pulse quickened. He looked at her, his jaw tightening. It was the same story, but now, it was being delivered with more force, more public exposure. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the other passengers had started to lean forward, their attention drawn in by the rising tension. This wasn't a quiet conversation anymore. This was something that was being witnessed. He stood up, his eyes meeting Caroline's, his voice calm, but growing sharper with each passing second. "You've checked my ID 3 times already. I don't know what you're trying to accomplish here, but this isn't normal procedure. You can't keep questioning me like this." Caroline hesitated for a moment, her fingers clutching the tablet in front of her like a shield. She glanced down at it, her gaze shifting, trying to find some sense of authority in the screen. But there was no excuse this time. There was no technical glitch, no system error. This wasn't about a mismatch. This was about power, about asserting control, about making James feel small. James saw it clearly now. This wasn't about security or protocol. This was about bias, about the assumptions Caroline made based on his appearance, his skin, his presence in a seat that was reserved for those who were deemed worthy of it. "Caroline," James said, his voice lowering with authority, "I've shown you my ticket, my ID, and my passport. There's no reason for you to keep demanding it. This is harassment." The words felt heavy as they left his mouth. Harassment, he had never used that word so directly before, but now, There was a long pause, the kind where the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Caroline didn't respond immediately, her lips tightening into a thin line. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes flicking nervously around the cabin as the tension thickened. James felt the eyes of the passengers on him. Some were staring openly, others pretending to be absorbed in their own activities, but clearly aware of what was happening. It was like being put under a spotlight. His every word and movement watched and dissected by those around him. "I'm sorry, sir," Caroline finally said, but there was no sincerity in her voice anymore. Her tone was cold, almost rehearsed. "I'm afraid I'll need to verify it again. It's policy." James clenched his fists. He had been polite. He had stayed calm. He had tried to diffuse the situation, but now it was clear. Caroline wasn't going to stop. She was playing a game in which he was the target. Something snapped inside James. This wasn't just about his rights anymore. It was about something more fundamental. Dignity. He wasn't going to allow this woman, or anyone, to make him feel like he didn't belong. Not in that seat. Not on that plane. Not in the world. "You know what? I'm done with this," James said, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through the growing tension like a knife. He straightened up, his posture now unyielding. "You've had more than enough of my identification. I'm not showing you another thing. If there's an issue, you need to handle it somewhere else, but not here. Not with me." Caroline's face reddened, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. She had pushed him too far, and now she was beginning to realize it. She looked around, noticing that some of the other passengers were starting to whisper, some even turning their heads to watch. The cabin had gone quiet. The tension was palpable. "Is there a problem here?" A new voice suddenly cut through the silence. This time, it wasn't Caroline. It was Gregory, the purser, a tall, broad man who now stood at the front of their pod, his eyes narrowing with authority. Behind him, Caroline seemed almost small, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Gregory's voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of intimidation in it. He looked at James, then glanced at Caroline. "What seems to be the issue, Caroline?" James met his gaze, unflinching. "The issue, Gregory, is that I've already shown my ID 3 times, and now I'm being harassed for no reason." Gregory's eyes flicked between the two of them, the weight of the situation suddenly hitting him. He didn't want to get involved, but it was too late now. The tension in the cabin had reached a tipping point, and no amount of authority or politeness would make it go away. Just as the tension reached its peak, the quiet hum of the aircraft was suddenly interrupted by a clear, authoritative voice coming from across the aisle. The entire cabin, still heavy with the weight of the confrontation, seemed to pause and turn toward the source of the interruption. "Excuse me," the voice said, calm yet firm. It came from Elizabeth Warren, the woman who had been sitting across the aisle, quietly reading her newspaper. She was now leaning forward in her seat, her gaze fixed on Caroline, her voice carrying across the cabin with an ease that made even the flight attendants take notice. "I've been listening to this exchange for the past few minutes," Elizabeth continued, her tone now directed at Caroline, her words measured but unwavering. "And I'm afraid you're wrong." She wasn't raising her voice, but it was clear to everyone that she was not backing down. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The eyes of the other passengers now flicked between James, Caroline, and Elizabeth. Some of the passengers, who had been watching the drama unfold with a mix of confusion and concern, seemed to exhale collectively, as though they too had been holding their breath. It was as if a new power had entered the situation, one that wasn't going to stand idly by. Caroline, taken aback by the interruption, stiffened. The practiced politeness in her smile faltered for just a moment as she looked across at Elizabeth, her eyes narrowing in annoyance. "Ma'am, this is a matter for the crew to handle. It's nothing for you to be concerned about." But Elizabeth didn't flinch. "Actually, I am concerned," she said smoothly, her tone still calm, but laced with authority. "And I am not just a passenger observing this situation. I'm an attorney, and I know exactly what's going on here." The words landed like a bomb. The cabin went silent as the other passengers took notice. An attorney. This wasn't just some casual observer. This was someone who had legal expertise. James could feel a strange surge of relief wash over him, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone else could help him navigate this mess. The power dynamic in the cabin shifted immediately. Suddenly, Caroline's actions seemed less like standard protocol and more like blatant harassment. "I've been sitting here, watching as you've repeatedly singled out Mr. Morgan for no reason other than what appears to be your own prejudice," Elizabeth continued, her words now carrying a sense of purpose. She turned her gaze from Caroline to the other passengers in the cabin, addressing the entire room. "And I can tell you, right now, that's not how this is supposed to work. Mr. Morgan has provided his identification multiple times. This situation has escalated far beyond what it should be." James felt a weight lift off his shoulders as Elizabeth spoke. He had been fighting this alone for so long, trying to keep his cool, trying to avoid creating a scene for Sophie's sake. But now, with Elizabeth's intervention, it was clear that he wasn't alone anymore. Someone else was standing up for him. Someone with the authority and knowledge to challenge the situation in a way that James couldn't have done on his own. Caroline seemed to shrink in front of them. The smugness that had been evident in her behavior earlier was replaced by something closer to discomfort. She glanced nervously at Elizabeth, clearly out of her depth. "Ma'am, I don't think you fully understand the procedure here," she said, her voice wobbly. "No," Elizabeth replied firmly. "I understand perfectly well. What you're doing is wrong. What you're doing is not just inappropriate, it's discriminatory. And if you think that you can get away with this kind of behavior, then I'm afraid you've underestimated the situation." The cabin was silent now, save for the faint hum of the engines and the soft rustle of a few passengers shifting in their seats. The tension had shifted, and with it, the entire atmosphere of the flight. Caroline's carefully constructed authority had been stripped away, exposed for what it really was, an attempt to assert control over someone who had done nothing wrong. Elizabeth wasn't finished, though. She turned to James, her eyes softening. "Mr. Morgan, I want you to know that you have every right to stand up for yourself here," she said, her voice kind, "and I'm here to make sure you're not treated unfairly." James was taken aback by her sudden support, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had been so focused on dealing with the situation himself, trying to maintain his dignity and not cause a scene. But now, someone else was helping him. The relief he felt was overwhelming. Finally, someone was taking his side, not just for the sake of sympathy, but with the legal weight to back it up. The flight attendants, including Caroline, were now on edge. The rest of the passengers watched the scene unfold with bated breath. Some were looking at Elizabeth with a sense of awe, while others seemed uncertain of how to react. But what no one could deny was that the shift in power was dramatic. For the first time since the conflict began, James felt like he had a true ally in the situation. He could breathe again, knowing that someone was standing up for what was right. The uncertainty that had clouded his thoughts was replaced with something more solid. Support. James gave Elizabeth a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter now. The tension of the situation starting to dissipate. Elizabeth smiled and nodded back, her gaze briefly flicking over to Caroline. "Don't thank me yet," she said with a wink. "This isn't over, but at least now, we have the upper hand." The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted once again. The tension that had gripped the first-class section of the plane only moments before now seemed to be slowly dissolving, replaced by a tense but palpable anticipation. James sat back and up. She had retreated for now, but he knew she would come back, and if she didn't, there would still be a record of the incident. one that could follow him long after the flight ended. This wasn't over. James glanced at Sophie, her small face lit by the soft glow of the tablet's screen, and something in his chest tightened. He couldn't let this moment pass without fully addressing the injustice. It wasn't just about proving himself right. It was about ensuring that this kind of thing never happened again. Not to him. Not to anyone. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer, pulling out his phone. It wasn't just any phone. This was a satellite phone, a device that had been an absolute necessity for his business dealings when traveling internationally. It wasn't the kind of phone you saw on the average flight. Only the wealthiest, most powerful people carried these. And while it might have been considered a luxury for most, for James, it was an invaluable tool for maintaining constant contact with his firm and clients no matter where he was. But today, it would serve a different purpose. James calmly dialed a number he had memorized for years. His finger hovered over the dial button for a moment as he glanced at Sophie again. The weight of his decision settled in his stomach. This was it. There was no going back now. The woman who had repeatedly questioned his right to be in first class was about to face the consequences of her actions. And, as much as he wanted to believe it wasn't personal, he knew it was. The phone rang twice before it was picked up. "Alana," James said, his voice even, though the anger that had been simmering in him since the first confrontation could barely be suppressed. He didn't need to say much more. Alana Mercer, his sister, knew exactly who he was calling, and why. James. Alana's voice came through the line, calm and professional. "What's going on? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," James replied, his voice steady, "but I need you to take care of something for me. There's been an issue with the crew. I need you to get in touch with Celestial Airlines operations and handle this immediately." Alana's tone shifted as she registered the gravity of the situation. "What happened? Is Sophie okay?" Sophie, still oblivious to the intensity of the conversation, giggled as she explored the airplane's in-flight entertainment system. But James couldn't ignore the tension in the air. The feeling that his dignity and his daughter's safety had been compromised. "Yes, Sophie's fine," he reassured her, but the words felt almost hollow as he spoke them. "It's the flight crew. Caroline, the attendant, has been harassing me about my identification. She keeps saying there's an issue, but there's nothing wrong. This is going beyond the normal procedure now. I don't care about the inconvenience. It's about the principle. They're treating me like I don't belong." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a quiet silence that spoke volumes. Alana had always been a no-nonsense, powerful woman in her own right. She was a high-ranking executive at Intersky Holdings, Celestial Airlines' parent company, and she wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. "I'll take care of it, James," she said, her voice full of resolve. "I've already made arrangements with the operations team. They'll be expecting my call." She paused for a moment before continuing, her voice steady but laced with underlying urgency. "I'll have someone in contact with the captain. This won't go unaddressed. I'll make sure it's dealt with. You're doing the right thing." James sat back in his seat, his grip on the phone loosening just a little. He knew his sister was as powerful as anyone in that industry, and once she set her mind to something, there was no stopping her. For the first time since this all started, he allowed himself to breathe. The weight on his chest lifted slightly as he realized that this would be resolved. The system was about to see how powerful a simple phone call could be. "Thanks, Alana," he said, the words filled with gratitude. "I'll keep you posted." "Of course," Alana replied, her voice sharp as ever. "I'll be in touch with updates. And don't worry, it'll be handled." James ended the call and turned his attention back to Sophie, who was now happily chatting with the flight attendant who had come by to check on them. James smiled faintly, but the peace he was trying to find in the moment didn't quite settle. He knew this wouldn't be the end of it. He had made a stand, and the consequences would ripple outward. But for now, he had the assurance that the situation would be dealt with. that the airline would be forced to take action. As the aircraft continued its ascent, James allowed himself a brief moment of relief. He wasn't powerless, and neither was his sister. This was just the first step in a much larger movement. The cabin was eerily silent as the aircraft began its descent back toward John F. Kennedy Airport. 2 hours into what was supposed to be a smooth, relaxing journey, the once gleaming first-class cabin now felt oppressive. The high-end decor, soft leather seats, and expansive windows framing a world that seemed far less luxurious in the light of the past few hours. The reality of the situation had started to sink in for the other passengers. Many of them were beginning to understand that something far more significant was unfolding than just an in-flight inconvenience. As the aircraft turned in the sky, pivoting back toward New York, the whispers had started once again. Some passengers exchanged glances, sensing the gravity of the situation, while others stared at James, their eyes filled with curiosity, confusion, and perhaps even a tinge of sympathy. But in those moments, James didn't care about their stares. What mattered now was the knowledge that this wasn't just his fight anymore. He had made the call to his sister, Alana, and that single phone call had set a chain of events in motion that was about to change the entire course of this flight. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to take a deep breath, feeling a quiet sense of empowerment wash over him. He had done the right thing, and the powers that be, his sister, the airline's leadership, would back him up. Sophie, sensing the shift in the air, glanced up at him. "Dad, what's going on? Why are we turning around?" Her innocent voice broke through the tension, grounding James in the present. He smiled softly at her, his voice steady but filled with a warmth that was all for her. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're just going back to fix a little problem, that's all." He reached over and gently squeezed her hand, reassuring her without going into details. Sophie's brow furrowed, but she nodded, accepting his answer. She was still too young to fully grasp the complexities of what had transpired, but James knew that this experience, this fight for dignity, would shape her understanding of the world in a way nothing else could. She was already learning an important lesson about standing up for what's right. As the aircraft banked slowly to the left, signaling their return to JFK, a sudden change in atmosphere took place. The cabin crew that had once felt tense and wary now appeared frazzled. Caroline had returned to her post, but her usual confident, authoritative demeanor was gone. She was now avoidant, skirting around the first-class section, casting occasional glances toward James, but never meeting his eyes. She had already crossed the line. The damage was done, and she knew it. Minutes later, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. The usual calm and reassuring tone replaced with something more urgent, more serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We regret to inform you that due to an unforeseen and critical logistical issue, we are diverting the aircraft and returning to John F. Kennedy International Airport immediately. I repeat, we are turning the aircraft around." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin, and a murmur of confusion began to spread as the passengers processed the announcement. For a moment, it seemed like the plane itself was suspended in time, as if every person on board was waiting for some sort of explanation, some rationale for this unprecedented action. Was it a mechanical failure? Was there a security issue? James knew, deep down, that this wasn't about any of those things. This was a direct result of what had happened on board. The captain's voice continued. "We apologize for the inconvenience, and we will provide updates as we proceed. All flight crew will be grounded upon arrival, pending a full corp." It was clear that the situation was becoming newsworthy, something that was about to break wide open. Meanwhile, Caroline, the flight attendant who had caused this entire debacle, remained at the back of the cabin, visibly shaken. Her previously pristine uniform now seemed disheveled, and her movements had become jerky and uncomfortable, like someone trying to avoid confrontation. James could feel her eyes on him as she passed by, but he didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He already knew what her role had been, and he didn't need to further engage with the unrepentant individual who had tried to strip him of his dignity. After a few minutes, the plane turned sharply, the hum of the engines changing as they began to descend. It was a slow, steady descent into the reality that was waiting for everyone on the ground. James glanced at Sophie once more, watching her as she leaned against the window, her small hands pressed against the cool glass. She was curious but content, her earlier confusion now replaced with excitement. James turned his head slightly, his eyes catching the figure of Gregory, the purser, who had previously confronted him with a less than helpful tone. Gregory now approached him again, but this time there was no air of authority in his step. He seemed almost subdued, unsure of how to handle the fallout. "Mr. Morgan," Gregory said, his voice softer now, a far cry from the coldness it had carried earlier. "I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience you've faced today. This situation has escalated far beyond what was necessary, and I want to assure you that we are addressing it at the highest levels." James nodded, but didn't respond immediately. He wanted to hear more than just empty apologies. He wanted action. He wanted real change. Before he could speak, however, the cockpit door opened, and a man in a sharp suit stepped into the first-class cabin. It was a high-ranking airline official, someone James recognized from the company's press photos. He moved toward James with a purposeful stride, ignoring the rest of the crew and heading directly for him. "Mr. Morgan," the man said, his voice respectful but clearly filled with urgency. "I'm Richard Hayes, Director of Operations for Celestial Airlines. I'm here to personally apologize for the disruption you've experienced today. I've already made arrangements for you and your daughter to be escorted to a private area upon landing. We are also providing you with a full reimbursement for the flight, as well as further accommodations." The official's words were punctuated by a wave of genuine sincerity, but more importantly, it was a promise that the airline would take responsibility for what had happened. This wasn't just about placating a passenger, it was about rebuilding trust. James, still processing everything, nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said quietly, but his voice was firm. "I appreciate the apology, but this isn't just about me. It's about systemic change. I expect nothing less." As the plane finally touched down at JFK, the reality of the situation hit full force. The crew is being escorted off, some in shame, others in confusion. Caroline, once so sure of her actions, was now the one being removed from the flight. Her career, her position, everything had crumbled in the span of a few hours. James and Sophie were escorted through a side exit, away from the chaos unfolding inside the terminal. But as they stepped onto the tarmac, the flickering lights of a fleet of black cars greeted them, ready to take them wherever they needed to go. This wasn't just an apology, it was a statement. Celestial Airlines was acknowledging its mistakes, and James was about to ensure that no one else would have to face this kind of treatment again.